Thanks to you at home as well for joining us this hour. Okay, this photo was taken sometime in the 1960s, I think at the late 1960s. You can see the protest sign guy there on the left, the guy in the front, and then the two guys walking behind him. But if you look closely at this, you can also see a little bit of color on the photo, right? It's a black and white photo, but you can see a little discoloration. You can see some red lines coming into the frame. And then in the margins, you can see there, it's 1, 2, 3. Someone has drawn on this old photo in red pen. They've numbered the people in this picture. And there's this other little part here at the bottom, this little blue-green tab. And that shows that they have figured out who these people are. 1, 2, 3. Now, they haven't figured out the name of the first guy, the guy with the protest sign. They only have a hometown listed for him. But they've got names and hometowns for number 2 and number 3, the other two guys in the photo. And you'll see it's the same thing here. People marching, some kind of protest, but then scrawled on the photo in a marker, 1, 2, 3. Cataloging and indexing the individual marchers in this photo. These photos are not somebody documenting these marches and these protests just to show that they happened. This is not journalistic work. You can tell by the annotations on these photos that this is actually the work of an investigation. After the Supreme Court ordered the end of segregation in schools, after the landmark Supreme Court ruling Brown v. Board of Education, in the state of Mississippi, they established by law something they called the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. In 1956, the legislature in Mississippi passed, and the then Governor J.P. Coleman signed a law creating the Sovereignty Commission for the purpose of defying the federal government, and specifically of preserving racial segregation in Mississippi. The Sovereignty Commission's work included spying on the citizens of Mississippi and on outside activists who joined them in pushing for civil rights in the state. They collected their photographs, and they found out their names, and they compiled intelligence reports on the people of Mississippi. And this secret work went on for a very, very long time, long enough to go from grainy black and white photos like these to full color, long enough to capture thousands of images of people who we don't necessarily know, and also images of people like Martin Luther King Jr. This is one of Dr. King's mugshots, as found in the files of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. Mississippi Sovereignty Commission kept on with this work until 1973. The state officially disbanded the commission in 1977. And according to the official history, by that time, Mississippi, with this state agency, had collected enough intel on its own citizens to fill 6 filing cabinets, along with, quote, 2 unsealed pasteboard boxes, 2 separate folders in a manila envelope, and a bound volume of minutes. They locked those records away and ordered them kept under seal until the year 2027. Now, the fight to get the state to open up those records earlier started the same year they locked them up, started in 1977. And that fight was a long-fought fight. It took a very long time. There have been a lot of stages in that fight. But the reason we've got those photos that I just showed you is that these photos and these records are finally now all online. As of 2002, you can see everything in the collection. Someday, I myself am planning a long field trip to go sit in the archives of the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission to go through these records by hand, in part because they are filled with these incredible photographs. Also, some very, very telling memos, like this one, which was written in early 1965. So it was written between the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this is absolutely amazing. This is a state document, okay? Quote, "It's necessary that we remove from the files any reports of investigators which might in any way be construed to mean that the Sovereignty Commission has interfered in any way with voter registration drives or demonstrations. This would include those reports that mention contact with the registrars as to the number of applications received or the number who passed the voting test. It also means those reports which list the names of applicants for voter registration tests. These reports will be removed from the file and kept available for future disposal. A later decision on the disposal will be forthcoming from the director. All future reports of investigators must clearly show that the purpose of such investigation is to ascertain the names of any subversives or non-resident professional agitators, and that it is no concern of the Sovereignty Commission as to how many colored residents of the state of Mississippi make application to vote." And all of our records that show otherwise, we got to take those out of the files, you guys. It was hard fought to get him to do it, but to Mississippi's credit, Where you will find this incredibly damning memo now is on a Mississippi state website. This is no longer secret stuff. They are being open about what they did. For Mississippi, making these archives public is part of reckoning with the past. So is this. Mississippi is building a new civil rights museum, reckoning with its past in a public and official way. It's the state that is opening this museum. It's the state that is paying for it with public money. And so now, curators for the state of Mississippi are traveling around the state, visiting people who have stories to tell and artifacts to share about the Civil Rights War in Mississippi. And for the people who had to fight the state for their civil rights, you got to think it must be a leap of faith, right? I mean, handing over stuff to the same state, to the state of Mississippi, which they fought for so long for their rights, trusting the state to handle these precious artifacts and to do right by them. The family of Vernon Dahmer, who was firebombed and then shot to death in Hattiesburg, Mississippi in 1966 when he was the local NAACP president, his family says they are willing to loan the state the wreckage of his firebombed truck with the bullet holes in it, but they are not willing to give the state the truck outright because the family does not yet have complete faith in the state running this new museum. The people who are planning this new telling of history say that it's not going to be whitewashed. They're going to tell all sides of the story. They're going to tell the story of the people who fought for civil rights, but also the much more uncomfortable story of the people who fought against it, including the state itself. I mean, this memo came from a state agency. It came from the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. The memo is CC'd to the governor's office. The memo that says, let's hide the part in our files that shows that we were interfering with black people's right to vote in this state. That's part of what we did. Let's hide those part of the files. Official state documents, CC the governor. They broke ground on the museum in Mississippi in October. Everybody was there for the groundbreaking. Governor Phil Bryant, you see there on the left, he gave a big speech, almost hidden by the flag there on the right. That's Myrlie Evers Williams. She's the widow of the civil rights martyr Medgar Evers. Among the items you'll be able to consider in this new museum is the gun, the hunting rifle that was used to kill her husband. This is very difficult stuff, but they are going ahead in Mississippi. And you can see in this photo from the Jackson Free Press that Ms. Evers really is nearly hidden by the Confederate emblem that's part of the Mississippi flag. The old Confederacy lives on in the Mississippi state flag. The rebel flag takes up much of the territory of what is the flag of the state. And yes, in a way, it's vestigial, it's a leftover, but also it's not. I mean, this is not a historic picture of Myrlie Evers. This is now. And that is still the Mississippi state flag. And sometimes, just visually, it is hard to tell the difference between what used to be and what still is. The local Mississippi chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans likes to buy billboards, even now, wishing happy birthday to Confederate heroes. They celebrate the War of Southern Independence. Quote, Southerners have less reason to be loyal to the collective enterprise of the United States than does any group of citizens. The South was invaded, laid waste, and conquered when it tried to uphold the original and correct understanding of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That, you would think it's vestigial past, it's still here, is an uncomfortable thing. And it's a very uncomfortable political thing about the guy who is giving the incumbent Republican U.S. Senator from Mississippi a run for his money right now. Chris McDaniel's challenge for that U.S. Senate seat currently held by Thad Cochran. Mr. McDaniel's challenge has been dogged by reports of his having been a featured guest at a Sons of Confederate Veterans neo-Confederate event. Today, Chris McDaniel's dealing with the challenge of audio surfacing from his old radio show in Mississippi, in which he said that if they pass reparations for slavery, he will stop paying his taxes, and so on. Right? Interestingly, though, when this scandal broke today, Chris McDaniel and his campaign said they weren't worried about it. His campaign said there will be no consequences for the Republican Party in Mississippi, even if a pseudo-neo-Confederate guy like Chris McDaniel beats Thad Cochran. Don't worry about it. It won't make it less possible that the Republicans can hold on to that U.S. Senate seat, because his campaign tells NBC tonight, quote, it is metaphysically impossible for a Democrat to win in Mississippi, even if the Republican's a guy like that. Why is that? This year's the 50th anniversary, of course, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The president today not only lauding it as an American achievement, but tried to get very gritty and detailed and realistic and unromantic about what it cost to do the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The president today praising President Lyndon B. Johnson, talking about how hard it was to get the Civil Rights Act passed and the political cost that he knew he would pay.
He knew that he had a unique capacity as the most powerful white politician from the South to not merely challenge the convention that had crushed the dreams of so many, but to ultimately dismantle for good the structures of legal segregation. He's the only guy who could do it. And he knew there'd be a cost. Famously saying, the Democratic Party may have lost the South for a generation.
Between the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Democrats told each other the story that they would lose the South for a generation. Yep. And now, according to Republicans in the South, and nobody's contesting them, it is metaphysically impossible for a Democrat to win statewide office in Mississippi, even as the state reckons with its own culpability for the recent past, even as Mr. Antebellum Ball is a potential Republican nominee for the United States Senate this year. Commemorations like the ones today at the Johnson Library, they are for the heroes, right? They are for the people who were right and who were brave and who we remember as heroes. But the reason we keep living through it again is in part that we forget what it was that the heroes had to be brave about and brave against. It is one thing to tell the story of the people who were right. Part of understanding why it is such a big deal that they were right is remembering who was wrong. We forget to remember who was wrong, not just who was right. Joining us now is Michael Beschloss, NBC News presidential historian. Mr. Beschloss, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Reginald.
Let me ask you about what President Obama said today in this long and complicated and sort of passionate speech when he talked about the legacy of President Johnson and Democrats' political consequences for supporting civil rights. Was he right, and what should we understand about that?
Well, he was right, and what he was quoting Johnson was saying, probably after both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that the cost of this would be to lose the South to the Democrats. Remember, 1968, the state in the Union that went for John Kennedy by more than any other, was Georgia, upwards of 60%. And those were white voters who were voting for Kennedy because they wanted segregation. That's how big a change this was. So the result was that Johnson knew that, yes, the Democrats would lose the South. He said for a generation, it's still going on, as you've said very well tonight. So he was probably over-optimistic. Johnson hoped that the result of the Voting Rights Act would be that you'd enfranchise so many African-American voters that ultimately they would help to overcome that, and the Democrats would be on equal turf in the South, and that hasn't happened yet.
How did LBJ himself react to the aspects of backlash that happened during his political life? When he could see what he had predicted happening, how did he react to it?
He knew it was going to happen, and it happened actually in a much more dramatic way. The Voting Rights Act was passed, as you know, in the summer of 1965. He went down to celebrate at the LBJ Ranch late that summer. That was the time that the riots in Watts occurred. Thousands of rioters, 20 people were dead. The police chief in Los Angeles, William Parker, made this incendiary remark. He said, that's what happens when you give people civil rights and tell them that they've been abused by the law. They develop this kind of disrespect for the law. A lot of people agreed, even Johnson's old aunt, a woman named Oriole Bailey, who lived on the LBJ Ranch, told LBJ he had gone too far. It went even further. 1966, the Democrats lost 47 seats in the House. It was attributed very directly to white backlash. And the interesting thing is, right after Watts, Johnson, who politically could see around corners, said, one of the people who's going to benefit from this backlash, this conservative movement against not only civil rights, but my whole great society, is a candidate in California for governor by the name of Ronald Reagan.
Wow. President Obama speaking at length today about Lyndon Johnson was remarkable, not just because of the anniversary being celebrated and because the president gave such an important speech, but President Obama has not talked very much about President Johnson before. Do you have a theory or any explanation as to why that is?
I can only speculate. You know, he gave his acceptance speech in Denver in 2008 the first time, the day after Lyndon Johnson's 100th birthday. You'd think, you know, speaking to a huge stadium of Democrats, you'd at least mention the guy's name. He didn't. His first year as president, Johnson was not much mentioned, to the consternation of a lot of the Johnson people. I think one reason is that first year, that was the year that President Obama was resisting an awful lot of pressure, largely from the Pentagon, to escalate the Afghanistan war. We do know that he read at least one account, one history book about LBJ making the decisions in 1965 that escalated Vietnam, that ultimately killed the reforms that Johnson wanted to do. So I think at least that first year, Johnson to Obama probably meant Vietnam.
It's fascinating. And I'm just thinking about having looked at those Mississippi Sovereignty Commission photos all day today.
Which are just fascinating.
Which are amazing. And what's interesting, just experientially looking at them and seeing the way the Sovereignty Commission was documenting and investigating not just the civil rights protesters, but also the anti-war protesters that came thereafter. And to see that legacy in protest and to see that legacy in reaction in Mississippi and to know that's also Johnson.
And you know why it's so important? You know, I was talking to a civil rights leader of the 60s not long ago. He said his granddaughter had learned about Rosa Parks, came home and said, I don't know why she was so great. If someone told me to go to the back of the bus, I wouldn't do it either. This is why we need things like that museum.
Michael Beschloss, NBC News presidential historian, thank you so much for your insights on this, Michael. It's nice to see you.
Absolutely, Rachel.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Lots to come tonight.